Hello and welcome to this week's video lecture on adaptation theory. I am really excited because I've been talking about doing this one for a long time with my American literature kids. So here we go. Today we are talking about adaptation. You might be asking yourself a question. What do each of these books, Emma, The Great Gatsby, The Road, and Captain America Winter Soldier, have in common? The answer is they have all been made into successful film adaptations, actually pretty recently, within the last decade. Film adaptation is so prolific that it has its own category in the Academy Awards, Best Adapted Screenplay. And film adaptation has been there since the very beginning of the medium. And even before then, right? People have been adapting and playing around with and recontextualizing old stories since human beings first started telling stories all the way back in ancient Greece and even probably before, right? Storytelling is a part of our nature, and we often love to tell the same stories over again, but in new and exciting contexts and ways. And so today and this week, we are going to explore what film adaptation is, or what adaptation is, how to talk about it in various ways, how it's most often talked about, and maybe some alternative ways to discuss adaptation with a little bit more nuance and complexity. And we're going to do that through the lens of adaptation theory, and in particular by discussing fidelity criticism. All right, so an introduction to adaptation theory. Just like last time, I'm going to be working through some of these slides. Adaptation is a visual medium, right? We're talking about film and comic and video game and all sorts of other forms of adaptation. And so I've got visuals to help us along the way. Hopefully that is useful and helpful to you. So as we work through this, we're going to be asking ourselves a couple of big picture questions. Number one, what are your favorite and least favorite adaptations, and why? Why do you find yourself drawn to specific types of adaptation and reject other forms, right? This is something we all do. We go to a movie, particularly a movie that you've maybe read or been familiar with the source material, and then afterwards you often have thoughts and opinions about what you think worked or didn't work with that film, or what changes they made in that adaptation, and your overall reactions to those changes. So today we're going to talk about all of those, and what those are rooted in, and how to talk about them with complexity. And of course, we're going to introduce you to fidelity criticism, like I said before. So here we go. All right, so there are super famous controversial changes within the history of film adaptation. One of the easiest ones, or the quickest ones that I was thinking about, is just a small detail, but it matters so immensely. If you're familiar with the text, which is Harry Potter, in the book series, Harry Potter very famously has green eyes. Why is that important, you might ask? Well, it has something to do with the shade of his mother's eyes as well. And of course, the actor playing Harry Potter has blue eyes, right? And in fact, the actress playing Harry's mother has brown eyes. And so that whole storyline is dropped from the film. It's a change. It's a small change, but it has some serious significance. In Lord of the Rings, elves show up during the Battle of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers, which is low-key my favorite of the three films. And this change is huge. It did not happen that way in the books. It was an addition made from the filmmakers. In The Shining, very, very famous film adaptation. If you've read the book The Shining, you know that Jack is supposed to be a really deeply troubled but largely sympathetic protagonist. And while he does try and murder his child and wife at the end of the book and the film, the way that he's portrayed in the film is entirely different than the way that he comes across in the book. And of course, our most recent and most horrific of the film adaptations is Cats, right? Which is adapted from the famous 1980s Broadway musical. And I don't know, all of it was bad? I don't know. Every change was controversial that they made. So when we're talking about adaptation and we look it up in the dictionary, we're going to probably come across two really famous definitions. One is biological, and this is the act of change, right? So if you're adapting, you are changing, usually based on some sort of environmental triggers, and you're making yourself more successful within that new environment. But in media context, right, we're talking about an altering or amending a text into another medium most often, right? So most often when we're talking about adaptation, we're saying we're moving something from one form to another, and because of that, some things change, right? All right. So within adaptation theory, we have a really famous theorist named Linda Hutcheon, who kind of says when we're talking about adaptation, we're usually talking about in three different forms. One is adaptation, the product, right? An adaptation, right? So if you're talking about the film adaptation of The Great Gatsby, right? This is a product. This is something physical I can hold, and I can put it in my DVD player, and it will play, and it shows me something, right? But we can also talk about adaptation as a process, right? The process of adaptation, how things are changed or evolve as you revise and change and fit your source text into a new context. And of course, we can also talk about adaptation in terms of reception. And that is probably where we're going to focus our attention most today, right? Which is how are adaptations received, right? Here's the weird thing about adaptations. Have you ever been to a film or something like that where you, at the end, it says, you know, based on a book or based on a whatever, and you're like, huh, yeah, very strange. I've never heard of that before, but I'm sure it was very interesting, right? Here's the thing about adaptations. They're only adaptations if you know that they are adaptations, right? At least in terms of reception, right? If you watch a film and you have no familiarity with the source text, right? You are having a completely different experience than the person who is super familiar with the source text, but and watching the same film, right? Adaptation, it's only adaptation if you receive it as such. And so we're going to focus today on what do we do when we know the source text and we know the adapted text, and why do we have such stark reactions to those things? All right, so let's take Spider-Man 2 as an example, right? A famous adaptation, very, very successful financially and otherwise. Spider-Man 2 was released, I think, in 2011. This is covered 2004. And it grossed $785 million, hugely successful sequel to a hugely successful film. And as a standalone property, right, as a product, it has its own features. It has its own things that make it unique. As a process of adaptation, the script was largely based on a specific run of comics in the 1960s called Spider-Man No More. It's this famous series where Peter Parker abandons his costume and tries to live a life apart from his Spider-Man character. And this process of adaptation into film is something that you could explore. And of course, you could explore how people reacted to the film, which was largely positive. As 93% is one of the more well-received of the Spider-Man films. And one reviewer said, the way Sam Raimi was able to produce the story of Spider-Man with such style, realism, and above all, faithfulness to the Marvel original comic is tremendous, to say the least, right? And he goes on talking about how Raimi captured the spirit of the comic series and why that made the film so successful, right? His argument, because it maintained the integrity of the source product, the adaptation itself was also successful. And this is an argument that shows up again and again. Now, when we're talking about types of adaptations, we're talking about different types of adaptations. We're going to be focusing on film adaptation specifically this week, but there are many other types of adaptations across all sorts of genres, right, and mediums. And if you're not familiar with what a medium is, I've got a definition there for you, right? It's the object, process, or device through which something is done. So one example is like radio, right? Radio is a mass communication based on oral senses, right, that can communicate to large groups of people very effectively. Film adaptation, literary adaptation, theatrical, video game, of course, radio adaptation. There are all sorts of different types of adaptations. Are adaptations inherently inferior to the primary or original text on which they are based, right? There is actually a long history of thoughts like this. Virginia Woolf, very famously at the turn of the 20th century, said that um, film adapters are predators or parasites preying upon the great thinkers of the time, right? And she viewed literature as the prey, right, for this new up-and-coming art form called film. Leo Tolstoy said film was a direct attack on the methods of literary art. Robert Sam, who wrote much later in the 1980s about adaptation, said that the conventional language of adaptation criticism has often been profoundly moralistic, right? Critiquing and criticizing film and other mediums that sort of utilize and just draw from other literary sources, right? Terms like infidelity, betrayal, defamation, violation, bastardization, vulgarization. These are very common terms when you're talking about adaptation. And he was sort of interested in why people were so upset about film adaptation. Now, Stanley Kubrick, famous film director of the 70s, 80s, and prior, once said, if it can be written or thought, it can be filmed. And I think that is sort of the alternative, bold view, right? That there is no limit to what you can adapt. Now, fidelity theory is based on perceptions, right? Like we said, you only know it's an adaptation if you are aware of the source text, if you are aware that they're drawing from something else, right? And so fidelity theory sort of came up out of that belief, right? And it says that an adaptation should be criticized and critiqued and understood in conversation with the source text, and that this is the best and most effective way to understand what an adaptation is doing, right? Now, fidelity theory is marked often by an inflated loyalty to the originality of the source text and the unoriginality or the devaluation of any adapted works. This doesn't have to be the case with fidelity theory, but it is often the case, right? There are sort of 7 different things that underline fidelity theory that can be detrimental. 1, right? It views literature as an older and thus more significant, more artistically rich artistic medium. It says that film steals from potential readers of literature, right? That it preys upon literature and then utilizes that to sort of bring more people into the theater. It also has said that films are too easy, right? Have you ever heard the argument, right? I'm going to just watch the film because it's just easier and more compact than a book that it is based upon, right? And all of this has been leveled against film adaptation and adaptation in general as a way of sort of critiquing it and disparaging it. But that doesn't have to be the relationship that fidelity theory has to have, right? Sam states that fidelity theory often investigates the vital connections between the two texts, such as the filmic recreation of setting, plot, character, themes, and the style. And that's what we're going to focus on this week, right? Not saying that the film is better or worse than the book that it was based upon, but looking at the relationship between the two and how they build upon, expand, or diverge in interesting and successful or maybe even unsuccessful ways, right? Sam also states that examining our own reactions to adaptations can illuminate what we value in the source text, right? If there's a character or theme or plot that is omitted or changed in an adaptation, it sort of shows us why we are so attached to those particular aspects or ideas present in that source text. In other words, our reaction to an adaptation tells us more about ourselves than it does about the actual thing being adapted. Crucially, regardless of context, it is vital that a fidelity critic does not disparage creative choices, right? Making a bold new change to a source text isn't always bad, right? In fact, good and bad are like 2 of my least favorite words within my classes, right? Instead, it's much more important to sort of examine, explore, and analyze why they made the choices they made, and what the effect of those choices are. And so that's what we're going to do this week, right? We're going to try and hold back ourselves from just outright mocking or disparaging a particular text, and instead explore and understand why they made the changes they made, and what's going into it. I want to leave you with a couple of film reviews that I pulled that sort of use this language. And you'll note that our last lesson of the week really explores how fidelity criticism has sort of integrated itself within culture at large, right? So many creative people and critics often use these terms when talking about an adaptation. And I think it's important to be aware of that and to explore how they use those terms in maybe positive and negative ways. So bucking broomsticks, talking pictures, peripatetic staircases, everything is just as you might expect in Chris Columbus's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Potterphiles are sure to get what they want if what they want is, in fact, an exacting version of J.K. Rowling's charming children's fantasy. But if it's enchantment they are after, that's quite another matter. This is in Rita Kempley's Washington Post review of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And you can note that here she has a very interesting relationship with fidelity criticism. She's not saying that the film was loyal to the book and thus was a success. In fact, she is taking very much the opposite approach, right? She's saying the film is so loyal to the text that it is sort of drained of life and creativity, right? It's a bold claim by Rita Kempley, but I think an interesting one to explore, right? Here's Mick LaSalle from the San Francisco Chronicle analyzing Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Rings, right? Watching it, one can't help but get the impression that everyone involved was steeped in Tolkien's work, loved the book, treasured it, and took care not to break a cherished thing. Here he's saying loyalty to the source text, fidelity, faithfulness, is what made the film adaptations of Lord of the Rings so successful, right? And so you can see him borrowing the language of fidelity criticism in his review. All right, so this week we are going to explore fidelity theory in all of its complexity. We're going to start by just sort of doing more guttural reactions based on this lecture. And so I encourage you to use some of the language we've talked about, talking about medium and talking about text and talking about fidelity and faithfulness and what's going on there and creativity. But as we get further into the week, I want us to go a little bit farther afield and explore not just what has been lost in an adaptation, but what has been gained from an adaptation, right? And view the conversation between source text and adapted text as an open conversation between equals, not a conversation between something inherently superior and something inherently inferior, right? Adaptation theory has moved beyond simply faithful is better and unfaithful is worse. And I think adaptation today has a lot more nuance and complexity that it can offer you. So I look forward to your responses and seeing what you have to come up with as you think about your favorite film adaptations of literature or comics or other sort of art forms, video games, whatever, and exploring the choices these artists made, why they made those choices, and what the impact of those choices are. All right, have a great week.